What prompted you to write this book? You've been teaching at Harvard Business School for decades.
Well, I mean, what prompted me, this goes back 8 years. Things move slowly in academia compared to startups. And I had encouraged a pair of former students to launch a business. I thought they had a great idea. I had a lot of confidence in them as founders. I actually was an investor. And the business they launched, Quincy Apparel, in New York City, and focused on designing and selling better fitting, affordable, and stylish apparel for young professional women. The key there is better fitting. You can usually get two of the three: stylish and better fitting, but not affordable, right? Because it's got to, cost $1,000 and have to be tailored somewhere. Anyway, that was the goal. They were both tall and had trouble finding work clothes that fit them well. And they did textbook perfect job of testing the idea the way we teach. There's this movement that came out of Silicon Valley 12 years ago called Lean Startup. And the whole idea is just basically have an assumption about your opportunity and test it before you invest lots and lots of money in building the product and marketing and so forth. And they did that. They ran trunk shows. Folks who are listening who know the fashion business will know trunk shows are a thing. And you bring samples, people try them on. People did pre-orders, and the women who came to these shows loved them. They raised $1 million. They wanted to raise $1.5 million. That's part of the failure story. And launched the business. Sales were strong, repeat purchases were strong, but they had trouble actually manufacturing the stuff so it fits. So the returns weren't crazy high. They were actually on par with other e-commerce sites. But if your promise is better fit, you got a problem even if you're doing average. And so they were burning through their cash and went to raise more. And while they were making progress, they just weren't making enough progress to have investors with the confidence to put more money in. Ran out of money and shut the business down after a year. Heartbreaking. And I was close to the founder, so watched those dynamics close up. And I could point to a lot of things that went wrong, but I couldn't pinpoint the cause. So here I was, supposedly an expert on startup management. Failure, since something like 2 out of 3 startups fail, is one of the most important things in my field. And I was a failure at explaining failure. So set me on a quest to learn everything I could, see if there were patterns. Could entrepreneurs anticipate and avoid those patterns? And if they were going to fail, is there a way for them to fail less painfully and sort of actually get something from the experience? It really hurts when a founder fails.
Yeah, I guess I would love to, hear a little more about that feeling of failure. I read first-person accounts, and it just seems humiliating. And I've read things about founders who say that at parties they'll never mention that they ever had a startup, and they'll leave the startup community altogether, and they won't become entrepreneurs anymore.
Yeah, Christina Wallace, who was one of the founders of Quincy, this company I just mentioned. Left in sequence. One came out of the company before the other. The other kept going, sort of trying to rescue the thing. It only took another 5 weeks, frankly. But in that period, Christina, she's talked quite publicly about the experience. Sort of basically 4 weeks on her couch, eating DoorDash, every night, watching all seven seasons of The West Wing, and just, probably not clinically depressed, but probably not far from it, and ashamed to tell people what happened. Also fearful because her co-founder was still trying to rescue the company. So you can't go out and tell people that you left and why you left, and that you think it's on the verge of failure. And so, yeah, it stirs up super strong emotions: shame, regret, fury. A lot of founders will blame. It's a very human tendency to defensive tendency to blame other people for what went wrong. My co-founder dropped the ball. The investors pushed us in the wrong direction. The regulators did something crazy, and most founders, I find, have this period of intense emotion, sometimes depression, and it can take weeks or months to sort of snap out of that. And the ones who manage to do it, you can't avoid rumination. So there is always some rumination, but the best way to do it is to alternate the rumination with some distractions, side project, go take a course somewhere, exercise, and enough of that, and eventually you'll sort of wrap your head around what happened, and only then, when you sort of have settled the strong emotions down, can you actually start to make sense of what happened. And even then, a lot of founders never have really learned much from the experience, because the ego defense kicks in, and they never really make sense of their role in the failure.
Well, it seems, you wrote about the fundamental attribution error, and there's the horse and the jockey, and the people on the outside might blame the jockey, and on the inside they might blame the horse. And what's really wrong with that picture?
Yeah. So anybody listening who took Psych 101, if you were paying attention, you might not have been, freshman year in college. Psychologists have this thing that they call it the fundamental attribution error, and it's fundamental because it's like ingrained in all of us so strongly, and everyone will feel it when I describe it. It was like, if I did something wrong, something in the situation was just off, and there's no way it could have been me, because I'm me, and I'm talented and brilliant, and I'm trying really hard. So it was somebody else's fault, or the universe just conspired to sort of send an asteroid down and strike things. If you did something wrong, you were probably lazy or distracted, or you weren't motivated, or your head wasn't in the game. And we do this all the time. You get cut off by a BMW and you blame the self-centered jerk. If you're driving a car and you cut somebody off, it's the blind spot in your mirror, and like the manufacturer just never got that dynamic right. So same thing with founders, right? And investors. If you ask investors why startups fail, they will point to the founder over and over again, the jockey in your formulation. And this metaphor gets used and overused a lot in the world of venture capital. And if you ask founders why their startup failed, they will point to co-founders and investors and competitors that came out of the woodwork by surprise, and all sorts of things. And the reality is way more complicated. It's always some combination. The horse is the idea, the opportunity, the concept, and the jockey is the founders, and it's always a lot of both. But there are some recurring patterns, and all of those patterns involve some combination of horse and jockey.
Right, and the reality, like you said, is a lot more complicated. There could be, a million outside factors that contribute to this, not just an egomaniac founder.
Sometimes, Ivan, it's very simple. I mean, there is an asteroid strike, COVID hits, and COVID wipes out hundreds of thousands of small businesses, new businesses, through no fault of the entrepreneur. Right. And there's just not much to say about that. It's like it happened, and it's tragic. We wish it hadn't happened, but you don't have to spend a lot of time dissecting that one. The ones that are interesting are the ventures like Quincy Apparel that showed promise initially, enough promise to sort of assemble a team, sort of get people to come on board, to attract investors and so forth. And when one of those goes off the rails, it's can be tricky to figure out what really happened.
Yeah, you surveyed and interviewed quite a few founders and people in startups that have failed. And it's taken years to put this research together. I'd love if you could walk through this research process. It must have been.
Yeah. So the working title for the book for a long time was False Start, just like in track and field or swimming, where the athlete jumps the gun and in an effort to get an edge. And so my wife thinks it's ironic that I was working on a book called False Start and had an outline for the book in 2014 and revised the outline in 2016 and revised it finally in 2018. I sort of revved it up in earnest, and it took the pandemic, frankly, and sort of seated exactly where I'm seated now. And basically the ability to sort of put my head down and just crank for months on end to actually get the book done. So there is a silver lining out there for some people, anyway. I started, it was fascinating. The original concept for the book was like 50 ways that startups fail. And it was going to be sort of short chapters, 2 or 3 page chapters, pattern 17, pattern 18, pattern 19. And then this is what designers do. They basically take a complicated space and they simplify it. So gradually sort of thinking this through, sort of saw enough commonality between the 50 to sort of compress them down to 6 patterns. And so the research around that was, as you mentioned, there was a survey of 470 early stage founders. These are both successful and less successful founders. And they raised at least $500,000 starting in 2015. And I asked them 50 questions about every aspect of them and the business and their team and their investors and so forth, trying to sort out were there statistical patterns between who did better and who did worse. And there were quite a lot, and they mapped pretty neatly onto the 6 failure patterns in the book. So that was part of the research, but the biggest part of the research was actually case study. So at Harvard Business School, where I teach, it's all teaching by the case method. You typically bring in one case study, usually takes the manager, the CEO, the entrepreneur up to some decision point, and the students debate, should we go left, should we go right? And so I had a bunch of these case studies and did more and more of them on failed startups. And then eventually launched a course on that is entirely focused on entrepreneurial failure with some trepidation. I was actually worried that, like, sitting there class after class would just bum the students out. And it had just the opposite. It actually, I would say, galvanized them, because it was a puzzle. I mean, I brought in the entrepreneur to every class, and they meet this person. It's like, wow, that person's really impressive. It's like, yeah, they just raised $4 million from really smart people, and they attracted this team, and they had this idea, but a thing went wrong, or many things went wrong. And so the students, I think, were galvanized by the puzzle of figuring out why these seemingly sharp individuals ran into trouble. I survey the students at the end of the course, and, like, has the course changed the way you think about becoming an entrepreneur in the next 5 years after graduation? And 20% say, yep, like, this scared the crap out of me. It hurt so much. This person sort of, ran up their credit card debt. They didn't have a spouse they could lean on, or family money. So like the financial situation's dire. They've spent the last 6 months working 80-hour weeks trying to save their company. So they've trashed their relationships with all their friends. And if they're married, their spouses sort of run out of patience, and like, and since that seems to happen 2 out of 3 times, I don't think I want that. 40%, so that's 20%, 40% said, yep, thank you for showing me that. I think I understand it better. I think I can handle it personally. Like, I think I've got the temperament and the stuff. And I actually kind of relish the challenge, and most importantly, I see that these people you brought in, like, all of them are doing something really cool right now. So, yeah, it's going to hurt like crazy for 6 months, but I'll learn a lot. And these people seem to have learned a lot. And so that 40% is even more inclined to do it. The remaining 40% said, I was always going to do it. I'm still going to do it.
Yeah, well, founders I've talked to have kind of, who bootstrapped, have talked about how they didn't want control from the outside, and they wanted, their vision kind of unadulterated.
Yeah, totally. That's a big thing for a lot of founders too. So, once you bring in the outside money, you're responsible for that. And, the definition of failure in the book is it's actually, I mean, I think most people think, like, well, isn't it kind of obvious what you're talking about? Actually, not really. Defining failure turns out to be trickier than it sounds. Dictionary definition doesn't help, which is a shortfall relative to expectations. Like, which expectations and whose expectations? Is it the entrepreneur? It turns out that only 40% of startups are actually run by the founder after 5 years. I mean, often as a company gets bigger and more complicated, it simply outgrows the sort of skills and like what the founder, like, many founders just love the early stage, and sort of building the thing and running a more complicated thing with hundreds of employees isn't for them. And it's quite natural either for them to replace themselves, or for the board to come to the conclusion the person's just not up to it anymore. So you can't necessarily gauge failure by the goals and objectives of the founder, although that's important. I keep that very much on radar. Society's preferences, there are financially successful startups out there that we all wish would just disappear, right? They've got addictive products, they exacerbate income inequality, they pollute, but they're financially successful. There are financially failed companies out there that actually show the way for other entrepreneurs to, don't do that. The book starts with a case on a social robot, Jibo. People might have remembered when it was on the cover of Time magazine, sort of invention of the year in 2017, I think. And this was a robot that it didn't walk, but it swiveled on. It had 3 separate speeds, so it could actually twerk and do little dances and so forth. And the robot would start up a conversation with you, as opposed to Alexa or Siri, where will respond to your prompts. This robot you'd come in and, hey, Ivan, I told you your commute might be heavier than usual this morning. How did it go?
Wow.
And so Jibo came out of the MIT Media Lab. Cynthia Brazil, who is the scientist there, has been working for decades on social robots. And in her research, she uses them to engage the elderly, sort of intellectual and emotional stimulation, and autistic children who would have trouble relating to humans actually will relate to this weird little robot. So Jibo raised $75 million. And they tried to position it for the elder market. Nobody would invest in that. Like investors who put money into ventures for elder care, they're looking for things like cell phones with big giant keys, something a lot simpler than a robot who can talk to you. And so they were scared off. So they repositioned it as a companion for a family. So you got a surly teenager who isn't talking to mom and dad. You put the robot in the middle of the kitchen, and somehow the robot will be in between the harried parents and the surly teenager. And that worked beautifully for some people, but just not enough people. And speaking of bolts, asteroids sort of coming out of the blue, while they were in the middle of all this, Amazon launched Alexa. The Echo is the device. Alexa is the agent inside the device for $200 when Jibo was selling for $900. So,
Wow.
boom, that pretty much ended it. Even though Alexa was never meant to really engage you emotionally. And so people, the Jibo failure was heartbreaking. People held wakes for the robot. They were trying to figure out what do you do with this thing? Like it was a family companion, it's more like kind of like a pet in ways for a lot of people. And so it shows. And so Jibo now is actually the inspiration for a next generation of social robots that are going to come back to the elder care market. So good for society, but bad for Jibo's investors. And so the definition I use in the book is investors didn't make money and never will make money, but it's got a lot of asterisks on it, that we need to think about this more complicated ways.
Right. I mean, just because Jibo failed doesn't mean that it was a failure. It just, it sounds like it influenced a whole nother generation.
Yeah. And I have a concept in the course and in the book of a good failure. And there's some failures that are blameless, like a business that shut down just because of COVID. And there are actually some failures that we ought to celebrate. An entrepreneurs do something new, and they do something new with limited resources. And somebody's got an idea, it's plausible, it checks out. And sometimes the only way to figure out if it's a good idea is to do it. And entrepreneurs who follow this lean startup approach I mentioned earlier, basically figuring out a way to test the idea without committing massive amounts of, months and months and massive amounts of resources, money and people. Sometimes it doesn't work, and it's good to learn that it was worth trying. No one should be ashamed of that. And I think those founders can hold their head high. And Jibo had many aspects of that kind. I mean, you couldn't do it fast. Because it turns out to be really, really hard to build this thing. And you really don't know if it's going to work until people live with it for a while.
Right. As opposed to Amazon, that's a huge company that has their R&D there's subdivisions that can put that time and money into that.
Yeah, I think that is the difference between innovation. Alexa is innovation, and Jibo is entrepreneurship. The definition of entrepreneurship is doing something new while you're lacking resources, at least initially. I mean, your job as an entrepreneur is go get the people, go get the money, you may need partners, go get the partners.
Yeah. So another kind of thing I've been wondering about when you were putting together this book, you mentioned it was hard to break it down to just 6 types of failure. What were your greatest challenges in defining these things and putting this together?
Yeah, the challenge was simplifying. I hope some people have heard of the hedgehog and the fox. It's one of Aesop's fables, but it's Isaiah Berlin is a philosopher, has written a famous essay about the
Yeah.
hedgehog and the fox, and he does it in the context of talking about Tolstoy's intellectual style. And just for anybody who's never read it, so first off, go find the essay. It's pretty cool. But hedgehog, the Aesop's fable, the parable is the fox knows many things, but the hedgehog knows one big thing. Fox is a scavenger; it'll hunt and eat almost anything. The hedgehog just knows how to roll up in a ball and protect itself. And so everybody has a different intellectual style. I'm very much a fox, and I've never met an idea I didn't like. So my problem in writing the book is a temptation to connect every concept I've ever run into in teaching and studying entrepreneurship into this stuff.
Infinite.
Yeah, and so finding the tension between making it as complicated as I could see it was, and as simple as it needed to be to sort of get a message across to the reader. Really, actually, a lot of fun and challenge as a writer. So I had a blast writing it. I had a developmental editor who was a fantastic intellectual sparring partner. Sort of, you're too simple here and you're too complicated there.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, luckily you did manage to narrow down to just 6 types of startup failure, which, that's very digestible. What was some of your favorites of those 6, or maybe what did you find most surprising, most unexpected?
I've seen a lot of MBA graduates launch new food products or new beverages, and it just turns out there's a million things you need to know if you're going to do that. Like how do you get the packaging right so it sort of stands out on the shelf and grabs the consumer's attention? How do you think about slotting allowances? The retailers will just eat you alive, sort of taking promotion money from you, in order to put your thing at the end of aisle, and like how much is too much? When do you move from local distribution to try to get into the national chains? So some places, one of the other failures in the book is a dating site website, and it turns out there's a million dating sites out there. 999,000 of them are failures. But the successful ones, if you look at the backgrounds of the people who launched the successful ones, it's not like they'd worked in another dating company or they had any profound insight about human relationships. They just basically had an idea and they tested it and it turned out to be a good idea. Okay, Cupid, coffee meets bagel, whatever. Every now and then one of these works. Most of them fail. And so you don't need industry experience there. So that was one big surprise. The other big surprise was a thing I call a false positive. Just like COVID testing, right? We all have learned about false negatives and false positives. Entrepreneurs turn out to be subject to false negatives and false positives in terms of the early response to whatever they're doing. False negative can be tragic because, like, you get a signal that your thing isn't working and you throw in the towel, and then 2 years later you read that somebody's done a SPAC and they're now a billionaire with your idea. It's like, I should have kept going.
Yeah, it doesn't get worse than that.
It does. Well, it can get worse than that, but that's pretty bad. And false positive is the opposite. It's you get an early signal that this thing's working really well, and you rush in the direction of the success, commit a lot of resources, and it's often the case that a lot of Jibo is a great example of this. There's often some foaming at the mouth, enthusiastic early adopters out there that have just been waiting for, they're banging on your door, like, when's the product ready? And if they're not representative of the mainstream customers you need later to build a successful business, and you overcommit in the direction of the early adopters, maybe with a feature set that's relevant to them, but like the mainstream would say, what do you need? So it's really pretty surprising how vulnerable entrepreneurs are to the false positive.
So you're kind of in this autopsy, so to speak. You're saying this is more of a false positive. How is this different from a speed trap?
The speed trap can start with a false positive. Thank you for that insight. That's an example of where the patterns start to tangle up with each other. And so for the false positive, to me, is an early stage pattern. Baru really never made it past the first couple of years. Sometimes a company can fall victim to a false positive, but get so much momentum that it can keep going. It doesn't fail. And a lot of listeners will remember fab.com, a online retailer of home furnishings. Sort of, if I look behind you at all, a lot of the stuff in your room could have come from Fab. They were into really distinctive design. And at the beginning, the curator of products, it was flash sale in the beginning, and they'd put like one thing up for sale a day. Rhinestone encrusted motorcycle helmet, a chandelier made out of martini glasses, sort of quirky and cheeky kind of design stuff. And people loved it, and they referred it to friends, and it took off like a rocket. And venture capitalists put a whole lot of money in at a very high share price, expecting continued growth. And Jason Goldberg, the entrepreneur behind it, was dazzling, charismatic salesperson. So he could sell the vision and with passion and conviction. And so they raised a ton of money with the expectation, and like no one's arm was twisted. Everybody wanted the thing to grow, and they pumped money in. And the first wave of customers, the early adopters, were indeed a false positive, but they didn't realize it until they went after the mainstream customers. And to get them, whereas the early adopters, everything spread through word of mouth and social media, the next wave you had to do, I mean, they actually were running TV ads and radio ads and so forth, and they're spending on marketing. So the customers are more expensive to acquire, and they're buying less and repeat purchasing less and not doing word of mouth referrals to friends. So they're worth less and they're costing more. You get a squeeze, but the investors and the entrepreneur think, well, we can fix this. You know, there's always confidence that, okay, that's temporary. We'll sort out how to market more efficiently, and we'll go find better customers. But they didn't. And the speed trap. So the speed trap, just like, you know, the police on the side of the road with a radar gun, this entrepreneur is going too fast. Jason doubled down on the problem. He was cloned instantly in Europe. There's this outfit called Rocket Internet in Berlin that will take a successful US startup concept and almost pixel by pixel copy it and launch it in Europe. And their gig is basically, hey, we're going to conquer Europe. That's like half of the world market. If you want to ever sell anything in Europe, you should buy our company out, because it's going to be tragic if you end up trying to compete with us here after we've gotten established. And Goldberg and his investors said, no, we're not playing. Airbnb had gone through this, Birchbox had gone through this, and Groupon had gone through this. They said, somebody's got to stand up to these guys. And so Jason went pounding into Europe, and you know, put like $150 million into building a big Berlin headquarters and launching all over the place. And it just never worked. He did drive the clone out of business, but it was a Pyrrhic victory. You know, it was so expensive and painful that it crippled the company. Meanwhile, the US was not working very well. And, you know, eventually, I mean, the investors will, particularly with a dazzling salesperson, put another round in and another round, but at some point they look at the economics of the, you know, the profitability of the customers and say, it wasn't there, it isn't there, we don't see how it's going to get there, so we're not going to put any more money in. You know, and if you're burning through capital because you're investing in inventory and investing in marketing, boom. So failed really fast. And so this is one of the late stage failures. When these things fail, I mean, there's like a giant steaming crater in the landscape. It's spectacular. These are the, yeah, this is Theranos, and you know, these are things we read about. When an early stage failure, when a Quincy apparel fails, and a handful of people who know the founders well will mourn. But Fab and Jibo were much bigger failures.
And how can startups avoid this? I mean, it seems like the easy answer would be just don't grow too fast. But how do you know?
I mean, I'm a professor, so I get to have clever frameworks. The test in the book is something we call at Harvard Business School the RAOui test, RAWI, I love it. It's there's some poetic license here. A raoui in Arabic is a reciter of ancient poetry. So epics, basically epic poems. So these failures are epic. So you want to use the raoui test to see if you can avoid them. Ready, able, willing, impelled is what it stands for. And so ready is basically, do you have what we call product market fit? And basically that's, you found a profitable way to, you maybe not making profits yet, but we can see how in the not too distant future, you're going to make profit from these customers, and you're going to continue to do that. And the market's big enough for you to grow at the pace you think you're going to grow. That's all ready. Able is, do you have the team, access to the people and the money you're going to need to grow? And sometimes there's a pace of growth that where you just, Baru went through this. A lot of the companies in the book went through this. You just can't hire people fast enough and train them fast enough to keep up with the pace of customers you're bringing in. Willing is usually pretty straightforward. This is for the founders in particular. Do you want to go through the personal sacrifices? You are going to be working 80-hour weeks for as long as you're growing at this speed, and there's going to be tremendous pressure, and things are going to go wrong, and they're going to go wrong faster because you're growing faster. And do you want to put up with that pressure? Number one. And number two, when you bring in outside money, which you need to do to grow because you're not making enough money yet to fund the growth from cash flow from the business, every round of venture capital you bring in, another venture capitalist joins your board of directors. And the job of the board of directors, of course, is to hire and fire the CEO. Eventually, the investors outnumber the founders on the board. And at that stage, if the founder's not doing the job as the CEO, you can replace them. And it happens a lot. And so willing is, are you willing to give up control of the company in exchange for the capital it's going to take to grow at the pace you want to grow? And then impelled is a tricky professor one. It's are you in a sector, a space where the nature of the business is going to force you to grow fast? There's this concept called network effects, where basically one fax machine, I'll date myself, is useless. Two are useful. 200 million start to make each fax machine a little bit more valuable. We could pick some social networking site to sort of update the reference. I should probably do that. And so if you're in a business with network effects, there's going to be a lot of pressure for you to grow. Same thing with switching costs. I use the example of the dog walking service. The switching costs are high. If switching costs for customers to move from one service to another are high, if you can grab them before they've signed up for anything, first-time customers who don't have an affiliation with any, you will invest heavily in marketing to go get those customers, because once you've got them, they aren't going to switch. The other service will have to bribe them like crazy, and it won't be affordable for the other service. So you're impelled if you have these structural attributes like network effects and switching costs that lead to a land grab and a real race. So you run the raoui test: ready, able, willing, impelled, and if the answer is no, then you sort of tap on the brakes a little bit and try to slow the growth down.
Right, and let's say it might be too early for that test. Maybe that startup didn't even get to a speed trap, or it's too late and we're hemorrhaging money and every day uses up resources. When should a founder throw in the towel? What is the test for that?
Yeah, the real test for that is, are you out of moves? Question number one. Question number two, are you miserable? And if you're out of moves and you're miserable, it's probably time to throw in the towel. What surprised me, a big surprise in doing this research, was how many of the failed founders I spoke to said they had waited too long to shut the business down. And there's a whole bunch of reasons why that's the case. The most important reason is just there are a bunch of moves you want to try before you throw in the towel. There's this concept of pivoting, changing some important aspect of the business, new types of customers, new features, whatever it's going to be, new way of making money. And you want to try the pivots. Each of them takes time. Like, you got to train workers, you got to educate customers, and then you have to see if it's working. You want to try to raise money from new investors. When that doesn't work, you want to go back to your existing investors and say, will you give me a bridge loan? It's something that will take me over the chasm, the problems. And it's a very emotional thing for the investors because they got to figure out whether they're throwing good money after bad. Good money after bad. So you work through all these. You try to sell the company. This is a tricky one because basically everybody in your space wants to have a look. So you have all these conversations with your competitors. You think, and of course they want to have a look. They want to see who your employees are and how much you're paying them, and and sort of learn more about your strategy. So you get all these expressions of interest that sort of eventually go sideways. And the ones who are interested are torn between just buying you now and wearing you out so they can buy you at a lower price and sort of get whatever's valuable in your company cheaper. And they've seen your cash flow, so they know exactly how long you have to survive. So you have all these moves you have to try, but then there's other stuff. There's basically the identity of an entrepreneur is somebody who persists. So if I quit, am I a good entrepreneur? Isn't it the job of an entrepreneur to keep trying? Would rather defer the ego blow and this enormous pain I described earlier, and you can just push it out into the future and deal with it later. So people wait too long, and in the process, they actually do a disservice to themselves. And a good thing for a failing entrepreneur is to fail in a way that there's enough money left in the bank that anybody who's owed money, employees, customers who placed a deposit, vendors who shipped you something, the investors won't get money back, but they may get 20 cents on the original dollar, and that's better than nothing. So that I call that a graceful shutdown, when actually everybody who's owed money gets paid back. And entrepreneurs who have a graceful shutdown preserve their reputation, their relationships, and especially if they go back, then sort of the healing process and learning process. If they can show they've actually understand what went wrong, their role in it, and what they would do differently next time. That combination of a graceful shutdown and being able to show you've learned something, it positions a lot of entrepreneurs to do it again and attract money and attract teammates. So that's a good failure.
What do you wish you could tell founders, to either avoid failure, or just advice that you just wish that they all knew, that you can kind of see them failing in the news and know that they're missing some crucial information?
Yeah, so the book closes with this advice. It closes with a letter to a first-time founder. A website called Startup Nation actually republished the letter. So if people are interested in it, they just Google my name and letter to a first-time founder. I think it'll take them to the Startup Nation.
And we can link it as well.
Thank you. And the message in that letter is basically slow down. That there's a lot of advice, call it conventional wisdom, on what makes for a great entrepreneur. And most of it's good advice most of the time. You hear these things, grow, be persistent, stay focused, be frugal. And each of those is important for an entrepreneur, but taken to the extreme, they actually can increase the odds of failure. And I think the biggest piece of advice entrepreneurs often get is just to trust their gut, trust their instincts. And that's good advice too, because being nimble is a big advantage, especially if you're competing with big, slow companies. But there are some decisions where your gut they're so important. Your gut is racked by emotions, and you're not going to be clear-headed when you make decisions about it. This is like, is it time to pivot? Should you invest, your scarce capital in hiring that expert? These things you need to not think fast and go with a gut instinct. You need to think slow. Daniel Kahneman, Nobel Prize-winning economist, psychologist, studies the psychology of decision-making, has a fantastic book called Thinking Fast and Slow, about system 1 thinking, which is the instinct, and system 2, which is more deliberation and sort of thinking through the trade-offs and pros and cons and so forth. And we need both. And an entrepreneur needs to know when to go with system 2, go with slow thinking, and sort of sleep on it, chart out the pros and cons, show it to somebody who knows your business well, sleep on it another night. And the message is, slow down and think fast, but also think slow.
Right. And think carefully. Yeah, that rounds out my questions, even though I'm sure there are a million more answered in this book. Was there anything else that you wanted to add here?
No, just thanks for this conversation. And to anybody who's listening, who's an aspiring entrepreneur, I think the message should be, you're probably going to fail, but there are things it could be a good failure, and you should be proud of that, and you should go for it, go for that. And there are things you can do to anticipate and avoid these patterns. And if you do fail, there are ways to fail well, gracefully, in ways that preserve your reputation. And there are ways that you can learn from other founders who've been through it, how to heal, how to learn from the process, and how to bounce back stronger.